All right, so in or throughout the 1600s and the 1700s, along the Atlantic seaboard or coast, England established 13 colonies, which would later become the United States. And in the textbook, they go into much detail about how these colonies were established. And in this class, we're not going to really get into that a whole lot. And what I want to talk about for this lecture is a term that you've probably seen before, mercantilism. And if you haven't seen it before, that's okay. You'll learn what it is now. And I'm going to begin by giving you the textbook definition. So mercantilism was the predominant European economic theory of the 17th and 18th centuries. So this, again, the 1600s and 1700s. And it was the belief that national wealth and power could only be achieved through a favorable balance of trade. And all that simply means is that you want your trade. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're exporting more than you're importing. It's not good to look at it that way. It just simply means that your trade, whatever you're doing, is profitable. Okay? So a favorable balance of trade, but that wasn't excuse me, that wasn't the only thing. And the way you establish this, let me do it this way, was one is through protective tariffs. Government subsidies to help industries. A large merchant marine was also important. That could easily be converted into a wartime navy. Now, I'm kind of going slow because I just want this is very important. You have a test coming up, and I want you to understand this. So I don't, I'm not meaning to bore you. I know you're probably getting a little bit tired of my voice. It's not easy to talk, lecture to the computer. But anyway, we have to do what we have to do. And so protective tariffs, which were taxes on foreign goods, would force consumers to buy domestic goods. All right, so I think no, it was the other class. So this is what a protective tariff is. A protective tariff. We talked about it. I gave a lecture to my American History 2 class, and we discussed this. I was thinking it was this class, but it's not. Okay, so a protective tariff is simply this. Okay, if you bring in, let's say you're a crawfish farmer, and you sell your crawfish for $5 a pound. And then the Chinese can send their crawfish over. They could actually harvest them, freeze them, send them over here. And even after all of those costs, they can still sell them for $2 a pound. Well, this puts out you out of business. The crawfish farmer, you're out of business. And so this is very depressing. and then you start drinking, and then your family leaves you because you become an alcoholic, and then you get really depressed and you have to go to AA. Okay, so this is not good. All right. So what could we do to ensure that you do not become an alcoholic here because you go out of business? Well, you could put a protective tariff on these Chinese crawfish. So for every, say, for every pound of crawfish that come in, we're going to put a, let's say a $4 tariff on it. So they have to pay a $4 tax, which means then what? That this goes up to $6, or actually it would be more, because if you did $4 per pound, all right, it would be $12. Then people would buy your crawfish. Now we all know Louisiana crawfish is better, all right, but for let's say they're the Chinese crawfish are pretty good, and it's hurting the Louisiana crawfish, all right. So this is what we would call a protective tariff. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. In this case, it's good. There are situations in which you may not want a protective tariff. All right, so we're not going to get into that discussion, but it's something that I want you to understand. It's not that example you would think, oh man, protective tariffs are good. There are some examples that maybe they're not so good. I remember they used to there was talk of putting Japanese vehicles, putting a tariff on Japanese vehicles, but they didn't do it. And what eventually happened, when like if you could get a truck in the 80s for $6,000, a Toyota truck. And a lot of American vehicles or trucks were at least $12,000. Well, the thing is if you buy the $6,000 truck, all right, it hurts this industry, but it helps who? It helps you, the consumer. Now you have $6,000 that you wouldn't have had if you had bought the American truck. So what ended up happening is the American vehicles, they got, excuse me, their standards got better, the quality went up, and the Japanese vehicles, their prices went up because demand was increasing. Okay, so that's an example of someone might say that it was not a good idea to place a protective tariff on those goods. Well, anyway, government subsidies helped vital industries to keep afloat when they were having a hard time. The goal of mercantilism was to keep wealth within the empire by making it self-sufficient. And mercantilists ultimately sought to render all importation of foreign goods unnecessary, and they wanted to use, of course, colonies. They wanted to use colonies to help them do that. So you had the 13 colonies. And you had England, which was the mother country. Now, how did this trade work? Well, you had the triangular trade route. Triangular trade. Well, by the late 17th century, you could say that the Atlantic Ocean, all right, was sort of like this great commercial highway. And so you had the Atlantic coast, this area. Okay, you had the Caribbean down here, England, and you had Africa. Well, why Atlantic trade patterns were very complex, the most important pattern was the triangular trade. In the first leg of the triangle, New England ship captains would sail to West Africa. And they would sell rum and purchase slaves. Sometimes guns as well. In the second leg, they sailed up to the they sailed to the West Indies or the Caribbean. And they sold the slaves and bought sugar or molasses. And then from there, other ship captains would go and these ship captains would go to New England and sell the sugar and molasses. Now, of course, when it's not the same person just bringing, these products. Okay, so this is a very the way I explained it was very simplistic. But this is, there were people that were bringing uh, guns, and other products to Africa, and then the same thing here, same thing there. So this is known as the triangular trade route. And what I want to talk about, very important, was what's known as the Middle Passage. What was the Middle Passage? Well, in the second leg of the triangle, slaves were transported to the West Indies, and this was a thoroughly gruesome business. And the vast majority of slaves, um, well, I don't want to say the vast majority of them, but many slaves actually died along the way. In fact, it was so bad that sharks, all right, had become conditioned to follow the ships because oftentimes when the slaves would die, they would be dumped overboard, and of course the sharks would eat the carcasses. So a good movie to watch. I mean, you could read the book as well, but it's a pretty good movie. Is Amistad. There's another book or another movie that came out a few years ago called Amazing Grace, because the person that wrote Amazing Grace had been a captain, I believe, upon one of these slave ships, and wrote that song when he realized how terrible it was. Okay. All right, so that's enough for now, and then I'm going to add a few more lectures, and then we'll talk about. I'll send you an email and talk a little bit about the test.